So I have here my bag front, I have my completed pocket, and I have some pins. Since this is the fabric version, I can use pins to make my marks and to hold my pocket in place, as well as my handles. I can see that I have a little bit of interfacing that is peeking out from the side, so I'm just going to trim that up. There we go, get rid of that. And now what I'm going to do is first find my center on here so that I know where to put my pocket. And the pocket, just so you can see one more time, I have folded it in half, right sides together, stitched it, and I turned it right side out. I pressed and top stitched the top edge. This right here is the bottom, that's where the seam is. That is going to go towards the bottom of the bag. So I'm just going to set that aside for now. And I'm going to mark the center on here. So I know that my bag is 13 inches wide, so 6.5 is my center. Grab a pin here and do 6.5. And you can draw a mark or you can use a pin. It really doesn't make any difference. I will be leaving that pin in for later because I'm going to, after I add my pocket, add my handles. So now I want to place my pocket 3 inches down. So this is a 2.5 inch ruler. That's not going to work very well. So let me grab my bigger ruler and I'm just going to set this on here. Align that right at the top at 3 inches and add my pocket, but I need to know where the center of my pocket is. So I'm going to do the same thing, find the center on here, put a pin, and what I do is just line up one of the lines of my ruler with the pin. So now I know where that center needs to go, just like that. And I'll add a couple of pins here. And one more over here. And here's what I found works even better than trying to put your pin in and pull it out and bend your pin. Put your pin into your layers like this, pick up your fabric and kind of fold your fabric and then push your pin, and then you won't bend your pin. And just to be double sure here, I'm going to check, and I am, let's see, 2 3/4 or so from the edge. And I'm about 3 from the edge here. So I think I'm off center just a little bit. So I'm gonna just scoot this over just a smidge. We have some wiggle room. The handles are gonna cover some more, so it's not so big of a deal, but just to be on the safe side. So 3 inches on each side, so now I am even. Okay. So now I've got it where I need it. So I'm going to take this to the machine and I'm going to sew these edges, even though it doesn't really matter because they will be covered. I'm going to sew them anyway. I'm going to do 1/8 of an inch and then I'm going to stitch across the bottom here. You can do 1/8 or 1/4. It does not matter. I'm probably going to do 1/8 because I'll have that foot on. So I'm just going to stitch the side, the bottom, and the other side. And then this piece will be ready for handles. So I've gone ahead and I stitched my pocket in place. I stitched the sides as well as the bottom. I did 1/8 of an inch. You can do 1/4 if you would prefer for the bottom. You just don't want to sew your sides more than 1/8. I've got my top completely open. I left the pin in up here. This is my center mark from my pocket. I'm gonna leave that in place and I'm gonna add one down at the bottom as well. So I'm just going to find my center here, which is gonna be at 6.5, which is right here. Go. Okay, just like to double check myself. So now that I have my 2 pins, I'm going to use my ruler and I'm going to pin in place my handle. So what I'm going to do here is just take my ruler and put my 3 inch mark at the bottom as well as the top, and I'm going to start pinning one side. So you can use a clip if you want down at the bottom, but I'm just going to use pins for this whole thing. And I'll pin here. Just keep straightening everything with my ruler, okay? And again, I like to kind of stab and then fold the fabric. That way I don't bend my pin. And I'll probably do one more. There we go. And I'll put one more up here, and then I'm just going to use a clip at the top since I'm not sewing all the way to the top. And I'll go over that in just a second. So now what I'm going to do is pull this down, and I want to make sure that I don't twist my handle. So I'm always checking to make sure that my handle has a nice curve to it, that it's not twisted or turned the wrong way. Double check that now, triple check it, because once it's sewn in place, it's kind of a pain to take that out. So now that I have my handle where it needs to be, I'm going to use my ruler, and my ruler is a 6.5 inch ruler. So I am overlapping onto this other handle just a little bit so that I can get my 6 inches apart. Your 6 inches is always from the inside of the handle, not the outside. And you'll know that it's correct because the edges of that pocket will be hidden. So I'm gonna add a couple of pins on this side. Keep using my ruler to keep everything as straight as can be. There we go. And I'll add one more. And if your handle is not 100% perfect, if it's off a hair, it's not a big deal. You're not gonna notice it. It's when you get a really large bow in the center. If you did not do it straight and your handles kind of bow out like that, that's when you're really gonna notice. A little bit here and there, a little 1/8 to a 1/16 is not a big deal. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna clip at the top. And again, I'm gonna keep this as straight as can be. And there we go. And then put one right over here. Using your ruler is gonna keep everything lined up, and you'll be much happier at the end with your results. There we go. And at the top, the handles are not going to touch each other, but down at the bottom, they are going to be lined up on the bottom seam. Again, it's the bottom, so not a super big deal if they're not perfect, but we want to line them up as best as possible. So before I sew this, I do need to make some marks up here. You don't want to sew your handle all the way to the top. By doing that, you're going to make the finishing steps impossible. So I'm going to use a chalk pencil. I think I have a green one. Let me just double check here. Well, I did. Oh, there it is. So the green's gonna show up a little bit better on this light colored fabric. And what I'm gonna do is mark 2 inches from the top, and that's gonna be where I stop sewing my handle. So I'm just gonna move this over here. I'll move my clip out of the way for just a second. And what I like to do is just make a little mark right there. Put my clip back in, keep this straight. And then I'll do the same thing over here. Mark 2 inches right there. And then I just find it easier to go this way. I'm just going to connect those lines and mark across my handle like that. And now I know where to stop. So now when I take this to my sewing machine, I'm going to start down at the bottom. You can stitch down here on the very bottom of the bag if you want to. Just make sure it's less than 1/4 inch. It's not a big deal if you don't. I'm going to start here following my 1/8 inch stitch line. I'm going to come all the way up, and when I get here to this mark, I'm going to go back and forth a few times to really reinforce it. That's going to be a stress point on the bag, so you really want to reinforce that. Then I'm going to come back down my 1/8 inch down to the bottom and do the same thing on this side. Since I decided to skip the front pocket on this sample, I can go ahead and add my handles. Before I do so, I wanted to go over some trimming with you. So sometimes when you're doing the piece to outside like I have here, things will get a little bit skewed from sewing and from pressing. And so what I did is I just went ahead and cleaned everything up. I want to lose as little as possible, so I just cleaned up the edges just a little bit, and I straightened up the top and bottom where it had been a little bit crooked. When you're doing that, just make sure of a couple of things. Make sure that your front and back meet up. And what I mean by that is not only are they the same size, but that your seams are going to line up as you go, because these seams are going to be sewn together on the sides of the bag. So if I trim my front, I want to trim the back to be the same. I also would go ahead and trim my lining pieces. So in my pattern, these pieces should measure 13 inches across by 15.5 inches high. If for some reason, let's say I have made some mistakes and done some trimming, and now my pieces are, let's say, 12.5 by 15 inches, I want to go ahead and make sure that my lining pieces are the same size. That way everything goes together nicely. I've already gone ahead and done this. I actually did not lose any size. I just cleaned up my edges where things had just been a little skewed and I had some loose threads. So now that these are ready to go, I'm just going to do one at a time and show you how to add on your handle. So I do not have a pocket on this one, so I don't have to worry about covering any edges. What I'm going to do is put my handle on here, and because it's cork, I can't really pin it. I could clip down at the bottom and at the top, but what about the sides here? I don't want my handle to get crooked when I take it to the sewing machine. So what I like to do is use a chalk pencil and my ruler. And first I'm gonna find the center, and I'm gonna mark the center at the top and the bottom. I'm not gonna worry about those marks. Those could be in anything because I'll make sure that they're within the seam allowance. So since this piece is 13, halfway would be 6.5. So I'm just gonna go ahead and there we go. Make a little mark up here in chalk and a little one down here as well. So now I have my halfway marked. I marked them within the seam allowance, but I'm also using a chalk pencil that I can very easily erase. So I want my handles to be 6 inches apart. So I'm going to grab my bigger ruler here. Now this is a 6.5 inch ruler. If you have a 6 inch ruler, that's even better. But what I'm going to do is line up my 3 inch mark at the top as well as the bottom. And I'm going to take my handle and I'm going to line it up here and use my ruler to keep everything straight. So I get asked a lot, does it matter which side goes in and which side goes out? Do I want the folded edge in or the raw edge out? It really doesn't make any difference. The most important thing about your handle is that it's not twisted. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put the raw edge facing out just because that's what I picked. And I just need to grab some clips. All right, so I'm going to put a clip right down here at the bottom. There we go. And I'm going to straighten this up, keep it nice and straight all the way up, and I'm also going to put a clip up at the top. I am going to do some marks, and I'll get to those in just a minute. And what I want to do here is to make sure that my handle is not twisted. So let me move this closer so you can see. When you're looking at your handle, this is how you want it to look. So since my folded edge is inward, my folded edge should be inward all the way around. I want to make sure that I don't have this happening or a bigger twist. So what I do is I kind of hold those edges together and just run my fingers up, and I can see that I am not twisted. So now I can go back here, scoot that up. And again, I'm going to use my ruler, put the 3 inch mark on the center, and now it is sitting on top of the other handle just because it's a wider ruler, but that's fine. And I'm going to clip down here and clip again at the top. Now I can take this to my sewing machine and sew it as is, but what can happen and what I don't want to happen is for my handles to shift while I'm sewing and to get a bow in them. So what I'm going to do is take my ruler and I'm just going to, again, line this up, and I'm going to make a couple of little chalk marks. So I'm just going to slide the handle out of the way for a second, and I'm going to make a couple of little chalk marks here on spots where I can really see it. And by doing that, I will have some spots where I can line up the handle while I'm sewing, and I won't have to worry about it being crooked. I'll do the same thing over here. Keep this nice and straight, because we want this as straight as we can get it. So I'll just make some little marks. These are erasable, but I'm going to put the handle right up on top of it. I broke my lead. There we go. And so you're not even going to notice Okay, now the last thing I'm gonna do before I take this to my machine is I need to make some marks from the top. I don't want to stitch my handles all the way to the top here. If I do that, it's not going to work for the finishing steps. I need my handle to be loose at the top. So I like to mark 2 inches down. So I'm just going to take my ruler here and mark 2 inches. So there's my 2 right here. And this is how I do it so I don't have to move my clips. I mark 2 and I mark 2 just a little bit. And then I will take my ruler, just like that, and just mark across there. Just mark a couple times with my chalk. And now I have my stopping points. So when I take this to my machine, I'm gonna follow my 1/8 inch stitching. I'm gonna start down here at the bottom, work all the way up until I get to this mark. I'm gonna stitch back and forth a few times to reinforce it and then follow that 1/8 inch down. And I'll do the same over here, and then I will get my other piece all set up with my second handle and my second piece back, and I'll be good to go. So now that my handles are sewn on, my pocket is added. If I'm doing a pocket, this sample does not have one. I am ready to go ahead and start assembling my bag. Since all of the assembly steps from here forward are the same, I'm just gonna work on this one sample instead of going back and forth like I have been. So what I'm going to do is on the bottom 2 corners of all 4 pieces, my 2 outside and my 2 lining, I'm going to mark and cut 1.5 inches. So that's gonna be on both of these corners here. So I've already done it on the lining, but I'm gonna move these out of the way so I can do the outside. And you have a couple of ways that you can do this. You can always turn it over and do it on the back side if that's a little bit more comfortable. Just using my ruler and marking 1.5 inches. I'm gonna do that on the other side. You can mark on the front. You can just use your ruler and rotary cutter if you don't wanna make any marks. It's totally up to you. And what I'm gonna do is just cut these little squares. This is going to be how I get the depth of my bag. So I'm using scissors. You can absolutely use a rotary cutter as well. Just be careful when you're using a rotary cutter that you don't cut too far in. If you push too hard and go too far into the corner, what can happen is you can create a tear, and that tear is not gonna go away. And if it's less than 1/4 inch, you can hide it. If it's more than 1/4 inch, if I go too deep, I'm just gonna have a tear in my bag. So I will usually start with a rotary cutter and finish with scissors. So just like that, always one little thread. I have that trimmed. I'm gonna do the same thing on this piece, and then I have my 2 lining pieces all ready to go, and then we'll move on to the assembly steps. I've gone ahead and trimmed the corners on the lining pieces as well as the 2 outsides. The lining in this bag does not have any pockets. It's just plain fabric. You can absolutely add pockets if you would like to. You'll want to do that before you go to the assembly part. If you are interested, I do have a zipper pocket tutorial on my YouTube channel. It will show you how to add a zippered pocket. So if you want to add one inside here, you can add some slip pockets, some divided pockets, whatever you would like, or you can leave it plain. It is a small tote bag and I didn't think that it needed it. And I also wanted to keep this video beginner friendly, so I chose to skip the pockets. So for the outside, a couple of things. Again, make sure that everything is trimmed and even because we are going to be lining up these seams. This is obviously one of the pieced ones. I do have some plain outsides as well, but when you are doing the stripped piecing, you are going to want to make sure that everything's lined up here. So I'm going to use clips for that. And for the lining, there's not really too much to worry about, not a lot to line up. If you did any trimming on here beforehand, because your size or anything was off, just make sure that these are the same size, double check before we go forward. So what I'm gonna do here is take my 2 outsides and I'm gonna put them right sides together. And if this was just a plain front, I wouldn't worry. I would just add a couple of clips on the sides. But since I have these seams to line up, I'm gonna go ahead and just line up each one of those and add a clip. And if I did my trimming correctly, this should not be an issue. If I find that anything is a little bit off, I will just have to kind of deal with that as it comes. So far, so good. Everything is looking good, lining up perfectly. Before I do the bottom, I'm gonna come over to this side. I like to do all of these seams first. And since this is cork, I do use clips. I also use the clips on fabric a lot. You might find that it's a lot easier than pins because pins just kind of get in your way. They're not always as easy with your layers of fabric. Plus, I don't want to stab myself, which I do every time I use pins. So I've gone ahead and I've done that. Now I'm going to come down to the bottom, and my cork handles should be lined up right at the bottom. If you find that that is a little bit thick, you might want to change your foot or increase your stitch length. That always helps when you're going across some thicker layers. It looks like my corners are off a tiny bit, which means I probably did not line up one of my handles perfectly. You can see here that this is kind of off. So now is the time that I need to make the decision if I want to line up that and let my handles be a little bit skewed, which they're probably off by about 1/4 of an inch, or if I want to line that up and, you know, worry about the corners later. Because it's the bottom of the bag, I'm not going to stress too much. I'm going to let that be a little bit off, and I'm going to worry more about my corners. So that was my choice. If that does not work for you, you can line those up and always retrim your corners if you need to. A lot of times when the corners aren't perfect, it will kind of go away when you box them, which we will get to after this. So that is all set to go. I'm going to do the same thing with my lining, putting them fabric right sides together. And I'll just add a few clips. I don't need too many here. I just have a few edges to line up. And I'm not gonna go crazy with the clips on here because I really don't need it. So when I take this to my sewing machine, on the outside, I'm going to sew both of these long edges as well as the bottom, ignoring the corners and ignoring the top, and I'm gonna sew that with 1/4 of an inch seam. Because it's the outside, I often will stitch this twice just to make sure that it's really secure. Make sure you backstitch when you start and stop. So do the sides, do the bottom. Now on the lining, the only difference is you're gonna sew these sides, but on the bottom edge here, you're only gonna sew a little bit on each end. I would say maybe about 1 inch or so, and you're gonna leave a big opening at the bottom. That's how you're going to turn your bag when this is all done. So you do not wanna close all the way across here. So I'm gonna take these to the machine and get them sewn, and then I'll come back and show you how to box your corners. So I've gotten everything sewn here. I'm just gonna go ahead and trim up all of my little threads here. Always have a little bit of a mess to clean up at the end. So again, on the outside, I stitched both of my long edges and all the way across the bottom. I did not sew any of the corners, and I didn't do anything on the top. And on the lining, I did the same thing, except I left a large opening down here on the bottom. That's gonna be for turning. So for the corners, what we're gonna do is reach your hand in here and you're going to be boxing them. And what that means is flattening them out. So I'm essentially pulling this seam to this seam and straightening this out. So this will actually become an outside corner. So just like that. And flatten it out. And let me just grab my clips. Sorry, forgot those. And I'm just gonna add a clip here. So you can see that is the inside of the corner that I've straightened out. Those are my seams that I just used my fingers to push in opposite directions. I didn't do any pressing of any kind yet, so I'll do this one for you as well. So I put my hand in here, I'm gonna straighten this out, pull these flat like so. Put a clip. And now you'll start to see that it's getting some dimension. That is how the bag is going to stand up. So I'm going to go ahead and do the outside as well. Reach in from the top here since I don't have that opening. And I'm just going to straighten it out. And sometimes you got to be a little bit rough with the bag, kind of pull it. You're not going to hurt anything, but you just have to make sure that you're getting it nice and straight. And I'll do this one as well. And here is a corner just to show you where it's not perfect. You can see, get rid of these threads here. You can see that my corner is not perfectly lined up. So when I straighten this out, this edge is up a little bit higher. Can I trim it with my scissors? Absolutely. Or what I do is kind of ignore it and just use this lower edge right here for my seam. Just stitch right across there and I don't worry that it's standing up a little bit higher. It's not the end of the world. So you're gonna take this to your sewing machine and you're gonna sew right across here 1/4 of an inch. Again, make sure that you backstitch. You're gonna do the same on both of these corners as well as the lining corners, and then your bag will be ready to put together. I've gone ahead and boxed the corners on the outside as well as my lining. So here's how that looks. You can see there's my handles down there, and I boxed those corners as well as the lining. The lining does still have an opening in the bottom for turning. So I'm gonna leave the lining wrong side out. I'm gonna leave that one alone, but I am going to turn my outside right side out. So this is gonna be your opportunity to check your seams. Make sure everything looks exactly the way that you want it. And if you have anything that you want to change, now would be the time. You can always take the seams out and adjust them if something is not lining up or if you haven't caught everything. So get in here and really poke those corners out. And I'll check that. That looks good. The side looks pretty good. Is it 100% perfect? No, but it's good enough and I'm happy with it. My handles, let's see how those look at the bottom. This corner looks good. So my handle on the left side is a little bit off, but I knew that that was gonna happen because I was more concerned with lining the bottom up. But because it's the bottom of the bag, I'm not gonna stress about it because when it's standing up, nobody's gonna see it and no one's gonna know it's there except for me. So checking all my seams, everything looks good. I caught everything, I'm pleased. So now to finish up the bag, I just have a couple things to do. I'm going to take the outside and put it inside the lining. So we want it right sides together. And this sounds a little bit confusing. It's gonna seem a little bit weird, but unfortunately bag making is kind of strange sometimes. So we wanna tuck the handles down. You don't want the handles up at the top just yet. We're gonna take this entire thing and put it inside the lining. And it can be a little awkward because they are the same size, so sometimes it's kind of hard to get it in there. And especially when you start getting into other bags and smaller bags, that can be just a little tedious, but we're gonna put that all in there, just like so. And I can reach in through this hole in the lining, pull the handles down if that helps. Sometimes on bags that have longer handles, that will help. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm going to clip my 2 side seams. So I'm just kind of nesting those seams together, pushing one to the right and one to the left. Put a clip there. Make sure that handle's all the way tucked down. Do the same thing here. And if you have any trimming to do, like I can see that I'm a little bit off right here. I've got some threads that I can get rid of. There we go. My seam up here is a little bit off, so I can just kind of trim that, or I can leave it. I will just slightly taper that just a little bit so that I don't have any holes or miss anything. I'll get that little piece out afterwards. And now it's perfect. So if you are making a bag that has anything else that needs to be lined up, anything from the lining to the outside, do that. But for me, I just have those 2 side seams. And now I'm just gonna work my way around and add some clips. All right. If you find that one of your pieces seems bigger than the other, like right now, it seems like my outside is a little bit bigger than the lining. It's because they're the same exact size, and you want to just kind of work that little bit of extra fullness in. When you take this to the machine, your feed dogs on your machine are going to help to ease that in. So if you have a really big gap, let's say I have, this much of a gap that I can't get rid of, something's gone wrong, I'm gonna wanna take these apart and check the measurements. But if I have like a little bit of gapping right here like I do, that's pretty normal. And what I'll do is I'll just kind of take my finger and just scoot a little bit of it over so I'm spacing it out. And when I sew this together, get that handle down there. When I sew this together, I will make sure that the piece that appears larger is on the bottom, and that will allow my feed dogs to work that in, so it's not going to be an issue when I'm done. So now that I'm all clipped together, I'm gonna take this to my machine. I've already taken my table off so that I can use the free arm. It's gonna be a lot easier to put this into the machine and sew like this than it is to put it like this where it's standing up. If you have a machine that does not have a free arm, you will have to do it the second way. You're going to have your foot in here and your bag is going to be standing up, where mine is actually going to be flat because I have a free arm. Trust me, it's easier to do with a free arm, but bag making can absolutely be done with machines that don't have one. I have a Janome HD9. It's an amazing bag machine. It goes through layers. It's just an awesome machine. I've definitely mentioned it in other videos, but that is one of the downfalls, is it doesn't have a free arm. So I have to kind of work it a little bit differently when I'm doing this sewing. So what I'm gonna do now is sew all the way around, 1/4 inch. You can do it twice if you want. I do that on a lot of bags, especially bags that are thick, to make sure I catch everything. Once I'm done, I'll come back, we'll turn it right side out, check it one final time, and then I just have top stitching and the hole in the lining to close. So I'm gonna head over to the machine now. All right, I am almost done, just trimming a couple of threads. I sewed around the top edge twice. I like to do that for durability, and also sometimes when you're sewing with the clips, they kind of get in your way. So I find that my first go around is not always straight. My second one is usually a little bit better. So now that I am stitched and I'm confident that everything is caught, I can see all the way around the top here. It looks good. I'm gonna turn through that hole that I left in the lining. And this is the not so fun part. It'll really work out your hands, but I'm just gonna kind of work a little bit at a time. Just keep rolling. And once I get most of the bag out, I can just roll the lining like so. Poke those corners out. The better you do that now, the better it's going to be in the end. I'll do the same thing with the outside. So I'm just gonna work in here. All right, check the seam, make sure that everything looks good. All right, so I'm definitely going to need to press this. My fabric's gotten a little wrinkled just from manipulating it. I just have 2 things left to do and my bag is finished. First thing I'm going to do is close up this hole in the lining. So what I'm gonna do here, you can absolutely do this by hand. I do not like to sew it by hand. So I'm just gonna fold these edges under just a little bit. My interfacing has come unstuck a little bit here, so I'll probably press that first. But I'm just gonna fold those edges under and clip it in place. That way I have a nice clean edge on the bottom. Remember, this is the very bottom of the inside of the bag, and once all of your stuff is in it, you're not even gonna notice it. So make it look neat, but don't stress about how perfect it is because it's all the way in the bottom. So I'm just gonna stitch across here. One thing I like to do that I've always done is, here is my opening. It starts here and ends here. I will start sewing past that and then stitch beyond that. It just helps to hold everything together and it looks a little bit more intentional. I'm gonna sew that less than 1/4 of an inch so I catch that edge nice and close. I wanna get like 1/8 of an inch. Once that's done, I'm gonna tuck this inside, and if I have any pressing to do, I can do that, but I'm just gonna tuck this all the way down and just kind of work your way around a little bit at a time. Use the iron if you need to, and I'm gonna top stitch all the way around here. Here's a great tip. If you're using cork or something outside that's a little stiff and it's giving you some issues, you can also clip it in place if that helps for you to take it to the sewing machine, or you can just tuck the whole thing in and kind of work it with your hands. Do whatever feels the best for you. So I'm gonna take this to the ironing board quick, and then I'm going to take this to my machine. I will close my lining, and then I will do my top stitching, and my bag will be done. I'm done. My bag is finished. I closed the lining. I turned it right side out. I'm just trimming a couple of threads here, and I had overstitched a little bit on my handle earlier and I forgot to trim that thread. So I'll take care of that. And I'm done. Everything looks great. It's all lined up. Let's see how my inside looks. I'm gonna do a couple of little trims here. So you may have noticed that when I was doing my final top stitching, that when it came to this intersection right here and this one right here, I went very slowly and I actually used my wheel and I hand cranked the needle. The reason for that is I can feel that this seam right here is pretty flat, but this one I think might have flipped when I was sewing it. I had originally nested those seams together so they were going in opposite directions, but I think that they had actually turned and were going in the same direction. When you feel that thickness, instead of trying to just, zip right through it and break a needle or possibly, hurt the timing on your machine or, make anything not work, what I would rather do is just take my time and kind of hand crank and guide the fabric. I also, it's because I have the automatic pivot foot as an option, which I love for the majority of this bag, I do turn that off as well. And the reason is, as I'm sewing around here and I have to stop and adjust, if my foot lifts up, even though my needle is down, my foot can just skew just a little bit, and then I will get one of those weird little stitches that kind of goes in the wrong direction. So by keeping the foot down, it holds more tension, and it also makes sure that I get a nice straight line of top stitching. This is the final bit of stitching that you're gonna do on the bag, and you wanna make sure it looks as good as it can. So I didn't sew my handles down. That's one thing, you don't want to sew those down. They are a little bit curly right now because of the cork. That happens sometimes. They just need to kind of flatten themselves out, or I can iron them and use the clapper. Other than that, I am all stitched. I didn't break any needles because I went nice and slow. My top stitching looks great, and I'm pleased. My bag is finished. So thanks again for joining me, and stay tuned for more instructional videos from Janome. Bye.